Hi, welcome back to our lecture. And for the final service that I want to cover, we're going to talk about AWS Codepipeline, which is a managed service that allows you to build a continuous delivery service. It allows you to build a delivery pipeline. So in a way, Codepipeline integrates together many of the other AWS service delivery components. You can use Codepipeline to check in your code to source control and then build the software artifacts and do your automated testing. And then Codepipeline can automatically deploy your output artifacts into your compute environment. And it does this by gluing together things like code commit and GitHub, the code build service, and code deploy. From a pricing standpoint, each pipeline that you build using the Codepipeline service will cost you $1 per month. But there's sort of a free tier in the sense that the first month is free for each pipeline that you create. So you could spin up a pipeline, and then if you decide you're not going to use it, you could delete it, and it essentially won't cost you anything because you haven't used it for more than a month. So what does a code pipeline look like in the Codepipeline service? The pipeline itself consists of a number of stages that you define, and these stages are executed sequentially. Each stage that you define also consists of a set of actions. Think of these as like a set of commands that are executed. And there are a number of different types of stages you can create, and I've listed a couple examples for you. You could create a source stage, and the source stage would retrieve your source code from a version control repository like GitHub. You could create a test stage where your code is going to be tested using unit tests or some sort of automated test suite. You could have a build stage that will compile your source code and produce an output artifact. And then finally, you could have a deployment stage where the output artifact is deployed and installed in a compute environment. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, some of these stages sound very familiar. Didn't we talk about these sort of stages in code build and code deploy? And yes, we did. You've got to think of the Codepipeline service as being sort of an abstraction layer that sits above services like code commit, code build, and code deploy. It's a way of integrating all of those services together so you can define different stages, and each stage might use a different service. The source stage might use code commit. The test and build stages could use code build, and the deployment stage could use code deploy. There are a handful of different actions that you can define for each stage. So each stage has what we call an action type. There's a source action, a build, test, deploy. There's an approval action. You could have a stage that requires some sort of manual approval. That could be a stage where you are performing some sort of manual exploratory tests. And each action type that you define in a stage supports a specific set of providers. For example, if you create a stage that uses an action type of source, then that stage can pull source code from providers like AWS S3 or AWS Codecommit or GitHub. If you define a build stage that uses a build source type or build action type, You can use the code build service. You could use an external Jenkins server or TeamCity server. If you have a test stage, you can use the code build service again, or you might use AWS Device Farm or a Jenkins server. And then on the deployment action type, if you have a deployment stage, you could deploy code into an S3 bucket. You could use a CloudFormation template to deploy code. You could use the code deploy service itself. All kinds of different things that you can do with the code pipeline service. You can think of, again, code pipeline is integrating different services together. It's sort of like this abstraction or orchestration layer that you can use to define a complete end-to-end pipeline and service delivery process. There are some technical constraints that you should be aware of when you are building a pipeline using the code pipeline service. Any pipeline that you build has to have at least 2 stages in it. And the very first stage of the pipeline must contain a source action. In other words, the very first stage of the pipeline must be a stage where your source code is being downloaded. And at least one of the stages must contain an action other than the source action. So in other words, one of the other stages has to be either like a build stage, or it could be a deploy stage, or one of the other stages. You can't have just 2 stages with both stages being source stages. That won't work. And every stage that you create has to have a name, and that name must be unique. One of the things I wanted to mention as we kind of close our discussion on the code pipeline service is that, oftentimes when we talk about software delivery pipelines, we're thinking in terms of our software applications. But pipelines aren't just used to build software. We can also use them to build infrastructure. And there are sort of like 2 general use cases that I see in the marketplace. One is where we have a pipeline that performs automated testing of our infrastructure. And the second is a pipeline where we automate the deployment of our infrastructure as well as our software. And kind of a simple example is you can imagine an infrastructure pipeline where we are building a CloudFormation template. And the pipeline might consist of a stage where we are linting the CloudFormation template, so we're validating the syntax of the template. We might then actually deploy the CloudFormation template and create a stack. We'll wait for those AWS resources to be built. And then once those resources are built, we'll actually test those resources. We might have a series of smoke tests or something, or maybe they're like security penetration tests that are trying to validate the infrastructure which has been built, to validate and verify that it's working properly. We'll have a stage that'll then tear down and terminate all those AWS resources. And if everything worked properly during the pipeline process, ultimately we would then publish the CloudFormation template because it's been validated and it's been tested. Now we can publish that into something like an S3 bucket and use it in the future and during our deployments.